Fáilte tróna go dtí acadamh Ríoga na hÉireann agus chuig an dara lécht sa srálaíochtaí Columban Cille 1500, Téacsanna agus Traidisiúin. Smiste Barbara ní Cormac agus táim seo chun fáilte speisialta a cuaróidh thar ceann leabharlann an acadamh agus thar ceann Coiste Léinn na Gaeilge, Litríocht na Gaeilge agus na Gultúr Celtic, a d'eagraigh an srá I bpáirt lena chéile. You are all most welcome to the Royal Irish Academy this afternoon and to the second lecture in the series, Columba 1500, Texts and Traditions. My name is Barbara McCormack and I am welcoming you here on behalf of the Royal Irish Academy Library and the Academy's Irish Language, Literature and Celtic Studies Committee, who co-organised the series. The lectures form part of a number of Academy initiatives to mark the 1500th anniversary of the birth of St Columba, née Colm Cille. The series programme aims to foreground recent research on the Columban heritage across a range of academic disciplines, and also to highlight the rich Columban treasures held in the Royal Irish Academy Library. This afternoon, we are delighted to welcome Professor Máirín Ní Dhonnchadha and Dr. Jacopo Bisagni from NUI Galway, who will speak on the theme of politics, piety and poetry, early Columban texts and traditions. I will now hand you over to committee member Professor Greg Toner, who will introduce Máirín and Jacopo and chair the session. Gur míle maith agóibh.
Gur maith Barbara, the fáilte rómha leis te, higgin léir seo be beirt chaintí rugad inniu. Iad beirt bhfuilscoil na hÉireann Gaillimh, sainneola iad beirt fasta Colm Cille agus an tréis luithe starlaite na Gaeilge agus tá an ahasam go bhfuil siad beirt linn inniu. Our first speaker today will be Professor Máirín Ní Dhonnchadha, Professor of Old and Middle Irish at Galway. Her research is truly wide-ranging and groundbreaking, spanning Old to Modern Irish literature and language. She has written seminal works on the position and role of women in Irish society, and many of the key insights relating to the law of Adomnán, on whom she will speak today, have come from her. Please put your questions in the question function at any time during either paper, and I will put them to the speakers at the end of the session. So, Curmish Tush Lehamati Elaine Yu Mashin, agus Curmish Fáilte Reverend Ní Dhonnchadha, Professor Máirín Ní Dhonnchadha, who will discuss the achievements of Adomnán. How are you?
Greg agus Barbara. To begin, I've 3 images of Iona, courtesy of the eminent Ian Fisher. First, we see the restored late medieval Abbey Church, then a wider view of the buildings, and finally, a view of the island looking south towards the Ross of Mull. Adomnán, as you know, was the 9th abbot of Iona. Like Colm Cille and the majority of intervening abbots, he belonged to Cinnéal Gonal, or sub-kingdoms ruled by this kindred in what is now County Donegal. But the lives of these other successors of Colm Cille are mostly dark to us, since whatever they wrote is almost entirely lost. However, it's not the dearth of writing by his predecessors that keeps attention focused on Adomnán. It's the calibre of his writing and the layers of meaning and subtle allusion beneath the surface. Adomnán lived through testing times for the Columban churches and shouldered heavy responsibilities as their head. But he also worked for the betterment of the laity and society at large. Scholars who have looked closely at his achievements, especially his writings, would say that he had impressive human virtues, that he was conciliatory and tolerant, self-effacing, subtle, diplomatic, an ascetic monk who was nonetheless driven to engage with society. From today's perspective, his major achievements would seem to be the Treatise De Locis Sanctis, the law named for him as Coin Adomnán, otherwise the Lex Innocentium, the law of the innocents, and most obviously his life of Colm Cille, the Vita Columbae. From here out, as time is short, I'll use the Latin form, Columba. For the same reason, I'll pass very quickly over De Locis Sanctis, Adomnán's account of Jerusalem and the other holy places in Judea, noting only that scholars have shown this to be a sophisticated piece of scriptural exegesis in which Adomnán integrates a complex range of sources with oral testimony. Its precise date is known, but it appears to belong to the first decade of his abbacy. This is the work in which he refers to being daily beset by laborious and almost insupportable ecclesiastical business from every quarter. All three achievements I've mentioned date to the last 24 years of his life. Of Adomnán's early life, nothing is known for certain apart from his Cíneál Gonal descent. It's not clear where he received his early or higher education or became a monk, or when he came to Iona. He had good reason to indicate in his life of Columba whom he knew or had known well in the Iona community, since the life was largely constructed around the testimonies of its members, living and dead. But the only person who comes into this category is Fuilve, his immediate predecessor as abbot. This Fuilve had spent the years 673 to 6 in Ireland, probably on a visitation of Columban churches, and it may be, as Máire Herbert has said, that Adomnán was recruited by Fuilve during this time, perhaps as a promising future leader of the Columban Familia, or Federation of Churches. Working back from his annalistic obit, which says he died in 704 in his 77th year, it's a fair guess, even if the number 77 is suspect, that he joined the community in his late 40s and became abbot aged 52 or so. My next slide is from Máire Herbert's essential work, of which we will soon have a new edition. The community Adomnán joined was always outward looking of necessity, being one of a chain of islands in a kingdom, Dál Riada, that straddled the Irish Sea. The community relied on support from Dál Riada on both sides of the sea and looked, of course, to the kindred of its founder, Cíneál Gonal, which was part of the over-kingdom of the Inéal. The Columban Familia grew in tandem with the rise of the Inéal and could exert a lot of influence when one of the Cíneál Gonal held the high kingship. But then, how do we regard Columba, who turned his back on Ireland, and his biographer, as Irish or Scottish saints or both? The conversion of the Picts, if one were to believe Bede, was the prime reason Columba came to Britain. Bede portrays him as a missionary priest. Adomnán, on the other hand, in his life of Columba, puts emphasis on Columba as monk as well as priest, a monk whose motive in leaving Ireland was to become a pilgrim for Christ, withdrawn from the world, the sea separating him from his homeland. There seems to be an important reference to Columba's preaching to the Picts in the Avra Chille, the elegy composed at or close to the time of his death in 597. As you see, I subscribe to the traditional dating of the Avra, but I should add that the debate is ongoing, and perhaps Jacopo may have more to say about this in his talk. The Avra speaks of Columba as the teacher who used to teach the peoples of the Tay, the River Tay, a rather general reference to Pictland. But by Adomnán's time, the relationship with the Picts was well established. In fact, one of the guarantors of the law of Adomnán was the contemporary king of the Picts, Bride mac Deirille. The Avra makes numerous references to Columba's scholarship. This bears mention because when we get to Adomnán's life, roughly a century later, we find a notable absence of references to this. I quote here a few disjointed lines from the Avra. I've combined them from two translations, that by Thomas Clancy and Gilbert Marcus in their anthology of poetry associated with Iona, and the second is from Jacopo's recent new edition of the Avra. The Avra poet says of Columba, "He was learning's pillar in every stronghold. With intelligence he made the glosses clear, he fixed the Psalms, he explained the books of the law, those books Cassian loved, the books of Solomon, he followed them. He studies the mysteries and lent out copies of the scriptures among the schools. He put together the harmony concerning the course of the moon, the course which it ran with the rayed sun, and the course of the sea. Self-denial and scholarship are the two things that distinguished the saint as preeminent for the Avra poet, as Máire Herbert noted. It's very clear that Iona fostered scholarship from Columba's time onwards. For instance, the keeping of annals began there in his day. The so-called Iona Chronicle, begun in the last third of the 6th century and continued there until about 740, is the only chronicle known for this period, and all the major collections of later Irish annals draw from it. It gives coverage to events not just in Dál Riada and Ireland at large, but also in the territories of Picts, Saxons and Britons. In fact, the community in Iona, though predominantly Irish, betimes included individual Picts, Saxons and Britons, as we know from Adomnán's Vita. And one of Adomnán's predecessors as abbot, Wyrchna, would seem to have been a Briton. Such contacts were bound to enrich Iona culturally, adding to its attractions as a centre of learning. Adomnán was certainly not the only scholar there in his time. For instance, the Nunensis, a work dated to the early part of the 8th century, is described by its recent editor, Roy Fleckner, as the first canon law text in the Latin West to attempt to compile laws for a Christian society, and not only for the Church. It was the first to deal extensively with conceptual questions pertaining to jurisprudence. It was the first to draw upon the Old and New Testaments systematically as sources for law. It was circulating widely in Europe by the mid-8th century, and its compilers were Riven of Darinish and Cuacuimhne of Iona, Cuacuimhne also being known as the author of the oldest hymn on the Virgin Mary. Another thing that enriched the culture of Iona was its links to Northumbria. These began some 35 years before Adomnán became abbot. When King Edgefrith died in 617, his successor, Edwin, drove his Edgefrith's sons out of the kingdom. Two of them at least, Oswald and Oswiu, were raised in exile among the Irish and were apparently baptized in Iona. When Oswald gained the crown in 634, after a significant victory fought under the cross, he attributed his success to Columba, as he told Abbot Chille. In time, Adomnán reports the exchange in his Life of Columba. Oswald asked Chille to send him a bishop, and so Aidan arrived and established his seat at Lindisfarne. Aidan was succeeded by bishops Meán and Columban, and under these three Iona-linked bishops, the church in Northumbria flourished for the next 30 years. However, a long-standing controversy came to a head towards the end of Oswiu's long reign, which put a strain on relations between Northumbria and Iona and dented the prestige of the Columban churches. It concerned the method of calculating the ecclesiastical calendar, and in particular the date of Easter. Into the 6th century, all the Irish churches followed a system based on an 84-year cycle, but new methods came to the fore and won papal approval. Many of the southern Irish churches conformed to the Rome-approved method by the 630s, but Iona held fast to the older system. I'll use the terms Roman Easter and Celtic Easter for convenience. The Northumbrian Church became divided on the issue, and the opposing sides met at the Synod of Whitby in 664. The spokesman for the Roman Easter was the Northumbrian Wilfrid. The spokesman for the Celtic side was Bishop Columban, who invoked Columba's custom as precedent. In the heated debate, Wilfrid questioned the sanctity of Columba, an insult that would be long remembered. The Roman view prevailed, and Columban and his party withdrew to Ireland, going first to Iona, where the community still observed the Celtic Easter. When Adomnán was appointed abbot in 679, 15 years after Whitby, this was still the case. In the interim, many other Irish churches had gone over to the Roman Easter, and one has to wonder, when exactly did Adomnán begin to change his mind? According to Bede, in his History of the English Church, his conversion happened during a visit he made to Northumbria in the late 680s, when, says Bede, he was earnestly advised by many who were better instructed than himself that he and his followers, living in the remotest corner of the world, shouldn't presume to go against the universal custom of the Church. One would gather from Bede that the remaining 15 years of Adomnán's life were dominated by profound disappointment at his failure to convert his own monks, and also that he spent most of the time in Ireland, separated from them. This is far from true, but the situation on Iona, when Adomnán became abbot was bizarre nonetheless. Here was an abbot who endorsed the Roman Easter, leading a community that firmly supported the Celtic one. As Claire Stancliffe says, how Adomnán handled the issue is one of the more intriguing puzzles of his abbacy. She suggests that there was something more than ingrained conservatism at work among the monks, and agrees with Thomas Clancy and Gilbert Marcus that the monks' continued adherence to the Celtic Easter was very likely because Columba had given it endorsement with his own computistical work. The work alluded to in those lines from the Avra, he put together the harmony concerning the course of the moon, the course which it ran with the rayed sun, and the course of the sea. To explain why Adomnán had visited Northumbria, we must go back a couple of years. In 684, King Edgefrith sent an army to Ireland, which made an attack on Bregha that, according to Bede, wretchedly devastated a harmless people and spared neither churches nor monasteries. Bregha was one of the kingdoms of the southern Ineil, and the overking of the Ineil Federation at the time was Fianach de Fledach, who ruled from Bregha. Edgefrith apparently had ambitions to control the northern half of Ireland, and he probably aimed to gain hostages to give him bargaining power with the Ineil. In the event, Edgefrith died the following year, fighting against the Picts at Nechtensmere. Edgefrith's half-brother Alfrith, who succeeded him, was in Iona around this time and seems to have spent considerable time there. His mother was an Lydian princess named Fianna. The Irish knew him as Flaun Fianna. Adomnán spoke of him as a personal friend. Bede says that he was very learned in the scriptures, but he was also known as a type of the wise king. So he was not an improbable candidate for the kingship, and Edgefrith, in attacking Bregha, may have intended to undermine efforts by the Ineil and Iona to promote his claim. The late Richard Sharp described Alfred's coming to power as the turning point in Adomnán's career. It gave Adomnán privileged access to the Northumbrian court. In fact, the visit during which Adomnán changed his mind on the Easter question was but one of a number he made. The first, apparently, was made to secure the release of the captives taken by Edgefrith, and they were escorted back to Bregha by Adomnán himself. Their release was a major achievement. On this or another visit, he presented Alfred with a copy of his treatise on the holy places, as Bede, who admired and used it, tells us. There are various signs that Edgefrith's raid on Bregha in 684 may have influenced Adomnán deeply and helped push him towards his next major achievement, the Coin Adomnán, the law of the innocents. The innocents in question are people who do not wound. In other words, non-combatants, people who should not be forced into military action, who should in fact be protected against violence. Adomnán's law covered offences against three categories of innocents: women, children, and clerics, and also dealt with church property, but it focused in particular on protecting women. It shows his concern for society at large. As one of the earliest laws aimed at protecting non-combatants, it has a special place in legal history, and in a recent book, James Houlihan presents it as a precursor to the Geneva Convention for the Protection of Civilians in Warfare, and to the foundation of the International Red Cross. Adomnán succeeded in having the law promulgated at a major assembly at Bar on the southern border of Ineil territory in 697. The surviving text, a compilation of different strata, includes a list of 91 guarantors of the law, among them representatives from all of the major churches and kingdoms in Ireland, the reigning Pictish king, and various clerics from Dál Riada and probably from elsewhere in Ireland. The identity of some of the guarantors is still not quite clear. It's probable that not all guarantors were present at the assembly in Bar. It must have taken Adomnán years of diplomacy to garner support across the two islands, and he may have canvassed the guarantors as he travelled about, as later texts suggest. The annals say he visited Ireland in 692, in the 14th year of his abbacy, and a Latin section of the law says he was instructed by an angel to go to Ireland and make this law after 14 years. And again, the following year, in other words, in 692 and 3. This is close enough to the time of Edgefrith's raid on Breche back in 684. It's also striking that Críos Gavlach, a law tract close in time to Coin Adomnán, instances together as examples of the kind of law to which a king may bind his subjects, a law to expel a foreign race, such as Saxons, which is surely a reference to the attack on Breche, and a law to kindle the faith, such as Coin Adomnán, or Coin Adomnán is the example given. And the Middle Irish preface to the Coin Adomnán also associates its origins with an attack on Breche. Otherns Law is concerned to see women protected from violence not only in warfare but at all times. It valorizes their role as life givers by drawing an analogy between them and Mary as Mother of God. This ties in with the images of Mary and the Christ child associated in the crosses of Saints Martin and Oran and Iona, the Kildalton cross in Islay, and the famous image in the Book of Kells, which you have in the next slide. Or rather the next slide again. The great sympathy for women that Adomnán ascribes to Columba in the Life, for the pains they suffer in childbirth, for instance, for the nun with the broken hip, for the woman in an unhappy marriage, is surely a sign of Adomnán's own concerns. In addition, he portrays Columba more than once as a harsh critic of persecutors of innocence. The synod at which the law was promulgated gives an approximate date for his life, because Adomnán refers to it, or refers in it, in the Vita Columbae, to an Irish assembly, using a term that strongly suggests the major event of 697. Adomnán tells that he wrote the Life in response to the entreaties of the community, which makes clear that there was no rift between him and them. The community wanted a life of their patron, but Adomnán also had a wider audience in mind in Britain and Ireland and further afield. This is evident from the extensive use he makes of the revered continental models of St. Gilmas, Saints Martin, Anthony and Benedict, to show that Columba was in the same mould and thus a worthy saint of the Universal Church. The Life is structured in 3 books with 2 prefaces. The 3 books deal in turn with prophecies, miracles and angelic visitations, all tending to show that Columba was predestined for saintliness. This is not a biography, and as for truth, one can be certain only of its devotional truth. Almost all the biographical data are found within 2 paragraphs in the second preface, where Adomnán gives the names of Columba's parents and states that in the 2nd year after the Battle of Culdrevne, the 42nd year of his age, Columba sailed away from Ireland to Britain, wishing to be a pilgrim for Christ, and also that he lived as an island soldier for 34 years. In the final chapter, Adomnán tells that Columba died on a Sunday, but he doesn't state which Sunday or which year, a glaring omission, as we shall see. Adomnán was concerned to ensure Columba's reputation and to restore the reputation of Iona following the Easter controversy. His life doesn't show the aggrandizing aims or the competitiveness that one finds in the near contemporary hagiography of Patrick and Bridget. What the Life seeks to foster is harmony between churches. It is not polemical. It refers only once to the Easter question, when Adomnán mentions what he calls the great dispute that arose among the churches of Ireland concerning differences in the date of Easter, and it makes no reference whatsoever to any method of calculating the date of Easter. As we've seen, his monks' adherence to the Celtic Easter may have been out of respect for Columba's scholarship. It's telling then, as Claire Stancliffe observes, that Adomnán's life, in sharp contrast to the Avra, makes no reference to this aspect of Columba's learning. Columba's final commendation to his monks, as reported by Adomnán, that they should have mutual and unfeigned charity with peace, encapsulates his own aims. One thing that makes fascinating reading of the Life is its multi-layered meanings. The best example of this occurs in the last chapter, as the late Jennifer O'Reilly showed in a most remarkable explication of Adomnán's use of scriptural and liturgical language. Columba's final days are shown to be full of activity. He consoles his monks by blessing the island so that it may remain free forevermore of snakes. But this is a reference to the poison of sin and heresy. When he blesses the grain in the monastery's barn, he is referring to spiritual sustenance, the manna of heaven. At one point on his last day, Columba is so weary with age that he has to be transported in a cart. But when the monastery bell sounds for the first office, Columba, says Adomnán, rose in haste and went to the church running, arriving there before everyone else. A reference to Romans 13:11. Run while you have the light of life, that the darkness of death may not overtake you. Adomnán makes absolutely clear that Columba died on a Sunday, sometime after Easter, but not which Sunday, nor does he specify the year. And this is important because the Irish annals are in conflict about this. As Jennifer O'Reilly explained, Adomnán's account of Columba's last days precisely marks out an 8-day period beginning and ending with the Sunday. While the image of the octave and patristic exegesis can refer to the whole of salvation history, it also denotes the celebration of the resurrection over the 50-day period which spans 8 Sundays from Easter Sunday to Pentecost Sunday. But in implying rather than stating that the Sunday on which Columba died was Pentecost Sunday, Adomnán sidesteps the issue of whether this was Pentecost Sunday according to the Celtic reckoning or the Orthodox Roman one. However, when one combines the knowledge that the Sunday on which he died was Pentecost Sunday and the fact that his feast day, which is, of course, which is always unvarying, it's the 9th of June, when one combines those two, it becomes clear that the year of his death is 597, calculated according to the Celtic reckoning, the one used by the community. Adomnán was acutely conscious of time, and that seems a most appropriate point on which to finish. Gurv Mahagwif.
Gurmila Moit Awari Vishin Gahinta. An excellent talk, a beautifully constructed talk there, giving us a history of Adomnán and his works. Thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, we can't hear people's applause, but I'm sure people are applauding silently in the background. We will take questions at the end, so keep your questions coming into the question function within Zoom. But we'll go on to our next speaker, Dr. Jacopo Bisagni. He completed his doctoral dissertation, I believe, under the direction of our previous speaker on the topic of the Avra Column Cille. He's made significant advances in the study of early Irish language, and he's probably now best known for his recent splendid edition and analysis of the Avra Column Cille. At 525 pages, I think, it dwarfs the size of the original text itself. But Dr. Bisagni is currently in Italy, and he says he has a slightly dodgy internet connection. So we have pre-recorded his lecture, but he is here. He will be here to answer questions at the end of the session. So today he will look into the Latin background of the Avra. Jacopo.
During the past 40 years, the study of early medieval Irish literature has been cleft in two by a controversy which, in spite of being well known in academic circles, has on the other hand barely reached the general public. This controversy has sometimes manifested itself as an opposition between so-called nativists and anti-nativists. In her book Literacy and Identity in Early Medieval Ireland, Elva Johnston presents this division as follows. On the one hand, there is an Ireland of Hiberno-Latin writers, respected scholars of international repute. It is the home of computists, exegetes, canonists, and geographers. It's a land of Latin learning. On the other hand, it is seen as an island dominated by ancient Indo-European ways, steeped in pagan traditions transmitted by semi-Druidic poets and judges. This island has but a thin skin of Christianity, favoring tradition over innovation and pagan syncretism over Christian faith. Confusingly, these two islands appear to have few or no points of contact. It seems to be a case not so much of distant worlds, but alternate universes. When reading this passage, it's not difficult to recognize which of these two Irelands has remained stubbornly anchored in the popular imagination, which remains fond of romanticized representations of an archaic and timeless Celtic Ireland. In fact, exciting research carried out over the past decades has shown that it's simply not possible to separate neatly the dimension of native learning from that of Latin learning. Indeed, it seems to me that in the last few years, the two alternate universes described by Johnston have finally begun to recognize that they may in fact inhabit the same dimension quite peacefully. When we examine the literature that has come down to us from the early Middle Ages, Celtic Ireland and Latin Ireland are inextricably interrelated. There is a very simple reason for that. In the large majority of cases, Old Irish literature was produced, copied and studied in the same churches and monasteries where Hiberno-Latin texts too were composed and transmitted by literati provided with a double-sided but seamlessly integrated culture and linguistic competence, Irish and Latin. When trying to make sense of the culture of the early Irish Church, I've often found it useful to begin with education. The Irish ecclesiastical literati were the product of an educational system that had its roots in the final centuries of existence of the Western Roman Empire, a system which had adopted, adapted, and absorbed, not without some struggle, the heritage of classical antiquity, supplemented by and filtered through the intellectual and ideological structures of Christianity. The culture produced by this dramatic encounter was a winning one. Indeed, this system of thought eventually spread throughout Western Europe, where it would hold sway for nearly 1,000 years. Ireland was not exceptional in this respect. We could rather say that between the late 6th and the late 9th century, the Irish literati brought a number of specificities to a Western European cultural framework, comparable versions of which could be found in the schools of Visigothic Spain or Merovingian and then Carolingian Francia. I will now try to visualize this intellectual world as a sort of early medieval mental map, at least as I understand it. At the center, the Bible, beginning and end of all knowledge, infinite repository of wisdom on all things imaginable, from languages to natural science, from history to prophecy. The study and meditation of the revealed Word of God was considered as the primary task of Christian scholars, who, moreover, could count on the priceless guidance of the Church Fathers, great writers such as Augustine, Jerome, and Gregory the Great, who had provided the necessary intellectual tools to explore the labyrinth of divine knowledge. The familiarity with the works of the Church Fathers eventually led the Irish literati to develop peculiar forms of biblical exegesis, whose exact character, however, remains somewhat controversial. Moreover, patristic authors like Augustine and Jerome made it abundantly clear that no proper understanding of Scripture could be achieved without an in-depth knowledge of languages. Developing a high level of Latin proficiency was, of course, indispensable, this language being the most direct route of access to the biblical text. But acquiring some knowledge of Greek and Hebrew vocabulary could be beneficial too, and this multilingual approach was perhaps one of the motivations behind the early Irish interest in the history, grammar, and etymology of their own language, an interest which undoubtedly contributed to promoting the written use of Irish side by side with Latin as a language of high culture. The Church Fathers also encouraged the investigation of the cosmos through disciplines such as arithmetic and astronomy, then known collectively under the umbrella term Physica. In the early Middle Ages, the Irish made a significant contribution to this domain, not only through direct observations of phenomena nearly unknown to classical authors, such as the tides, but also through the extraordinary proliferation of texts on computus, the study of time and time reckoning, essential for the establishment of the Christian calendar and especially for the highly controversial calculation of the date of Easter. Finally, the Bible, as well as several writings of the Church Fathers, could be used as reference works concerning the history of the civilizations of the ancient world. The Christian sources could moreover be supplemented with information taken from pagan works, such as Virgil's Aeneid, which in addition provided a model of grammatical excellence as to the use of the Latin language and poetic techniques. The reception of this double historical heritage, Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian, understandably led the Irish literati to wonder about their own history. Where did Ireland fit in all this? What was its place in God's providential scheme? Since earlier Latin works were basically silent on this point, native traditions and sources could be profitably interrogated in relation to the history of Ireland from its most distant past to the arrival of St. Patrick and the subsequent rise of the early Irish Church. You might think that this is merely an abstract theoretical construct, bearing little relation to the reality of Old Irish literature. Well, think again. There is one text that mirrors this mental map quite faithfully, straddling comfortably between the native and the transnational, between the native and the universal. That text is Avra Cille. The Avra is at the same time a lament for the death of St Colm Cille and a praise of the saint's monastic and intellectual virtues. The fame of this poem is great and is mostly linked to the traditional attribution to Dalán Forgail, chief poet of Ireland, who allegedly composed the Avra shortly after Colm Cille's death in 597 or perhaps 593. However, I've recently published my full arguments for dating this text to a much later period in the early 9th century. The Avra has survived in 10 main manuscript copies, ranging in date from the early 12th to the 17th century. All manuscripts except one present the same textual layout, one that was rather common in medieval Irish manuscripts. This layout is exemplified here by the famous Leabhar na Hire, written at Clonmacnoise around 1100 and now preserved at the Royal Irish Academy. The Avra is preceded by a preface in Middle Irish, clearly composed much later than the poem itself. The main purpose of the preface was to provide stories and poems explaining who wrote the Avra, when, where, and why. Immediately after the preface, the Old Irish text of the Avra proper begins here with the beautiful illuminated letter D. As you can see, the Old Irish text here in the green rectangles is copied in larger letters, but these words are then followed by a substantial amount of text in smaller script in the yellow rectangle. This is a running commentary that accompanies the whole Old Irish text. The Avra is a difficult and even obscure text, and its interpretation was already challenging for 11th and 12th century readers. For this reason, the poem was provided with detailed notes that explained obscure words and their etymology, clarified religious significance of several passages, and offered additional details concerning the life of Colm Cille and his time. Indeed, the Avra contains several references to Colm Cille's family connections and other contemporary individuals. Accordingly, This text would have been highly relevant to the exploration of the so-called Age of the Saints, which, as I've already mentioned, was a major component of the medieval interest in reconstructing the early history of Ireland. But what about the other elements on my mental map? Let us begin with the central element, the Bible. Explicit references to scripture abound in the Avra. Columb Cille is the saint who explained the true word and the books of the law. Moreover, he was not only a biblical teacher, but also an authoritative interpreter of the often obscure Word of God. He was a peak as to the book of the difficult law. He knew the Old and the New Testament, and he did not know any falsehood. The text often reminds us also that Columb Cille abided scrupulously by the teachings of the Bible during his time on earth. He followed the books of Solomon and the path of the four, that is the Gospels, written by the four evangelists. For this reason, after his death, he reached the land of Moses, the promised land of eternal life in heaven. But references to the Bible are not always so transparent. Take, for example, these lines from stanza 7. With good, righteous wrath, he used to fight a constant battle against the flesh, so that upon God's division the king's son will not go into the second saying, into the second verse. Thanks to the Middle Irish commentary, we understand that these lines must refer to an account of the Last Judgment found in Matthew's Gospel. After dividing up mankind into two groups, Christ first invites the righteous to join him in heaven, but then he condemns the second group to the everlasting fire of hell, and that is the second saying, the second verse. The poem also contains clear references to the techniques of biblical exegesis that the Irish literati learned from the Church Fathers. The Avra is known for focusing not only on Columb Cille's strictly monastic virtues, purity, fasting, restraint, etc., but also on his intellectual abilities and love of knowledge. With intelligence he made glosses clear, he established them, the Psalms, he explained them, the books of the law, books as Cassian loved. And again, he studied the mysteries, he has lent out copies of the scriptures among the schools. Two patristic authors are indeed cited by name. We've just seen Cassian, one of the great fathers of Western monasticism, and elsewhere we also find Basil, the author of an important monastic rule in Greek. Remarkably, the works of Cassian and Basil are mentioned together, also in the last chapter of St. Benedict's famous Regula. While it is unlikely that this text was widely used or even known in 9th century Ireland, this coincidence is nonetheless a striking reminder that Irish monasticism participated in a world of Christian learning that stretched way beyond the confines of the island. Patristic literature may also help to explain why the Avra was written in such an obscure style. Indeed, this peculiarity may be related to discourses on biblical obscurity found in the writings of the Church Fathers. This passage from St. Augustine's influential work on Christian doctrine will hopefully clarify what I mean. Some of the expressions in the Bible, Augustine says, are so obscure as to shroud the meaning in the thickest darkness. And I do not doubt that all this was divinely arranged for the purpose of subduing pride by toil and of preventing a feeling of satiety in the intellect, which generally holds in small esteem what is discovered without difficulty. The Holy Spirit has, with admirable wisdom and care for our welfare, so arranged the Holy Scriptures as by the plainer passages to satisfy our hunger and by the more obscure to stimulate our appetite. For Augustine, biblical obscurity is divine and wholesome, as he states in another passage. Obscurity hides spiritual mysteries from those who are unworthy, and at the same time provides a healthy exercise for the mind, stimulating its appetite, as he says. Augustine was not the only writer to use this kind of metaphor when speaking of such matters. In the 7th century, Isidoro of Seville, whose works were widely read in early medieval Ireland, clearly echoed Augustine when he compared biblical mysteries to the manna, the miraculous food granted by God to the Israelites during their 40-year wandering through the desert. Holy Scripture presents variations that benefit the understanding of each reader, like the manna, which gave a different flavor to the ancient people according to the taste of each individual. For this reason, in the holy books, one can find some obscure things and some clear things, so that the reader's understanding and eagerness may be increased. It is perhaps not a coincidence that the manna is explicitly mentioned in the Avra as Columb Cille's reward to those who follow him and his teachings. Now, it's true that the obscure style of the Avra has suitable vernacular comparanda. Old and Middle Irish literature offers many examples of texts written in the difficult style known as Rosk, which shares many formal features with Avra Columb Cille. However, Latin parallels should not be ignored, especially since some of these may well be related to patristic discourses on the use of textual obscurity to hide biblical mysteries, as has been shown to me by one of my PhD students, Grace Atwood, who is writing a most interesting thesis on this topic. One of the crucial texts for Grace's project is the collection of Latin poetry known as Hisperica Famina, probably composed in Ireland in the 7th century. One of the main features of this text, famously a favorite of James Joyce's, is that even mundane subjects are described in the most extravagant and verbally flamboyant manner. In the example you see here, the author expresses his joy at listening to scholars as they debate learned matters. An abundant springiness excites my chestly cave. I pluck mournful tormentousness from my lung, but I impede the joy-flowing storm in my thoracic arteries, when I espy the illustrious key masters of philosophy, who pour from their pharynx the limpid liquid of urban uttering and mould the snake-like syllogisms of erudition. To our 21st century minds, this may sound weird, or maybe playful, possibly ironic. In fact, there is considerable evidence that during the early Middle Ages, textual obscurity and extreme forms of verbal artistry could be used for very serious purposes, one of which may have been, as again has been suggested by Grace Atwood, to signal that a text was not to be read literally, but rather symbolically or allegorically. I should stress once again that this phenomenon is not limited to Ireland. Although presenting local specificities, manifestations of textual obscurity and linguistic experimentation can nonetheless be found, for example, in Anglo-Saxon England, in early medieval Brittany, and among Carolingian churchmen. To give but one extreme example, here is a passage from the Ecloga de Calvis, or In Praise of Bald Men, composed by the northern French writer Huckbald towards the end of the 9th century. This poem of 146 lines is full of complex imagery and learned classical references, and most of all, it is constituted exclusively by words beginning with the letter C. But the kinds of knowledge displayed in the Avra are not only religious. The secular disciplines make an appearance too, which is not surprising, given that they could indeed be part of the monastic curriculum in Ireland as much as elsewhere. Thus, Jonas of Bobbio, the biographer of the most famous Irish pilgrim saint Columbanus, finds it quite unproblematic that as a young man the saint devoted himself enthusiastically to the pursuit of grammar and the sciences. In a similar manner, grammar gets an explicit mention in the Avra in a very difficult line which might mean that Columb Cille mastered Greek grammar. Another passage refers to the saint's skill with wordcraft, perhaps even poetic composition, if this is indeed what lies behind the cryptic statement that the teacher wove the word. The Latin language has a strong presence throughout the text. As you can see here, Latin words are sometimes embedded in otherwise Irish sentences in a manner that may have resembled the bilingual speech of learned churchmen. Latin is present also in another form. What you see here is a complete list of the Old Irish words borrowed from Latin that occur in the Avra. Although many of these were undoubtedly fully integrated loanwords, it's likely that the Latin origin of at least some of them was still recognizable to Irish speakers, and this would have contributed to endow the text with a strong Latinate flavor. According to the Avra, Columb Cille was also skilled with numbers and scientific inquiry. Stanza 5 tells us that the saint reflected on seasons and calculations and elaborated an interweaving concerning the course of the moon. He ran the course along with the rayed sun. He ran the course of the sea. Behind the poetic imagery, it's not difficult to recognize that these lines refer to computus, the study of time and time reckoning, a crucial aspect of which is precisely the tricky interweaving of the lunar and solar calendars. Again, this should not surprise us, given that the study of the mathematical order of the cosmos received strong support from the biblical Book of Wisdom, where it is said that God arranged all things by measure and number and weight. The notion of cosmic order can be found elsewhere in Irish literature. For example, the Hiberno-Latin poem Altus Prosator, probably composed around 700, speaks of the created universe as a machina, a complex mechanism in which all components work harmoniously with each other. Moreover, the set of Columb Cille's scientific skills, presented in the Avra, corresponds closely to the 5 things that a learned man should know about each day, according to the 10th century Psalter Naran: the day of the solar month, the age of the moon, the running of the sea, the day of the week, and the day of pure festivals. At this point, I want to return to the mental map from which we started. The white boxes that surround the map now indicate the various aspects of Avra Columb Cille that I've briefly presented in my paper. As you can see, every circle on the map corresponds to elements found in the Avra. What this diagram shows then is that in this text, the sanctity of Columb Cille is demonstrated not only through the exaltation of the purity of his faith, the austerity of his monastic conduct, and the nobility of his origins. Instead, Columb Cille's holiness manifests itself also through his perfect adherence to the structure of Christian scholarship that dominated Western European culture from the end of antiquity to the central Middle Ages. The Avra constantly blurs the lines between native and Latin, between local and universal, effectively making these distinctions almost meaningless. The saint portrayed in this poem and his knowledge are both Irish and European, and Latin as much as Gaelic. This is not just modern theorizing. The manuscripts themselves sometimes give us evidence that the Avra was conceptualized in this way already by its medieval readers. Here's a detail from the page of Laura Nahire that I showed you earlier on. The first line of the Old Irish text is clearly legible. Dia dia dorogos riadias in agnush kulutrianeid. God, God, may I beseech him before I go to face him through the chariots of battle. Just above these words, we can see a gloss, an annotation written in very small script by a slightly later scribe. This glossator wondered why the word dia was repeated twice at the beginning of the poem, and this is the explanation he came up with. Epizeuxis is the name of this kind of technique according to Donatus, that is, doubling of the same word in the same line with no interruption. Instead of identifying it as a feature of native versification, the repetition of dia is here understood as a technique described in the Ars Maior of Aelius Donatus, a Roman grammarian who lived in the 4th century AD. Now consider that Donatus's Ars Maior is the book that introduced generations of students to Latin grammar and stylistics throughout the Middle Ages and practically everywhere in Western Europe. when seen in this context. All of a sudden, this tiny annotation written at Clonmacnoise around 1100 is no longer just Irish, but rather becomes a bridge made of ink, a bridge between Ireland and Europe, a bridge between the Rome of late antiquity, the Iona of St Colm Cille, and the monastery of Clonmacnoise, where these words finally landed on some parchment. Native and Latin, local and universal, Irish and European. Can you still tell the difference? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacopo. That was fantastic. A brilliant illustration, I think, of the richness of the text that lies at the core there. Thank you very much. Yes, we've got Máirín back online, and the real Jacopo. He hasn't changed his shirt since he gave that talk. I think we have a couple of questions come in. Please keep your questions coming on. I'm beginning to feel a bit like a radio host here. Yeah, with the first question here from Luke. Otherns Sanctis, among other texts, are very revealing about the type of textual materials he had access to. What can we say about his cultivated Latin style and the focused work of the scriptorium at Iona? Maybe we'll go to Jacopo for that.
Yeah, sure. It's perfectly appropriate question. And yes, the Loci Sanctis, far more than the Vita Columbae, tells us a lot about what kind of material was read at Iona in the scriptorium. This is a kind of source analysis that has already been done, I think, especially of a really good article by Thomas O'Loughlin detailing the library of Iona precisely on the basis of the range of materials visible in the Loci Sanctis. We can see a landscape of readings and literature quite comparable to that mental map that I've been showing. And in particular, the role of patristic literature is absolutely prominent. One of the authors mentioned explicitly most frequently by Adomnán in the Loci Sanctis is Jerome, who provided abundant explanations about the Hebrew names of people and places mentioned in the Bible. So it is a library. It is very much a Latin library. It is a library which has the Bible at the center and which has the fathers of the church, Jerome, Augustine, Eucherius of Lyon, and many other names around it. And it is also reflected in Adomnán's very refined, sophisticated kind of Latin that he writes.
Thanks so much, Jacopo. We have another question here from Seamus. Surely the original, in inverted commas, method of calculating the date of Easter came from the patrician tradition, which I imagine Columb Cille followed. What changed within the Universal Church to allow Bede to affirm that Columb Cille was an error in his computation? Had the Celtic Church altered the original teaching of Patrick and his predecessors?
Is that for me again?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've done a lot of work on computus, so yes.
It's a massive question. I'll do my best just to summarize the main points. We have absolutely no idea of which kind of Easter reckoning St. Patrick followed. Probably a version of an Easter reckoning that circulated in Gaul in the 5th century, but we don't know exactly what. The so-called Celtic reckoning, I don't think Celtic reckoning is a great term, to be honest. It usually in the technical literature is referred to as Latercus, which simply means an Easter table. And it probably came to Ireland from Gaul in the 5th century. And it is based on this 84-year cycle. Afterwards, there wasn't actually a single dichotomy between a Celtic and a Roman Easter. There were several other types of reckoning coming into play. And even in the 7th century, we don't actually know exactly which particular reckoning was followed by the Church of Rome. Probably a technique that was followed early on in the 7th century was that elaborated by Victorius of Aquitaine in the 5th century. But then we don't know exactly when the reckoning switched to yet another system elaborated by Dionysius Exiguus in the 6th century. So in Ireland, in the 7th century and early 8th, we can in fact imagine a situation where you have at least 3 different reckonings competing with each other, with Victorius of Aquitaine dominating in the south of Ireland, the Latercus certainly still practiced in Iona, and the method of Dionysius Exiguus, which was supported by Bede, spreading in the Regione Scotorum in Britain, as well as in the north of Ireland. So a very, very complex picture, which gradually simplified itself through the 8th century.
Thank you very much, Jacopo. That's a very helpful description there. Could I kind of twist that question around a little bit and turn to Máirín, because I kind of struck in your talk and Adomnán really supporting the reform date and standing out against his community, and quite a number of things were coming through within your talk. What does that tell us about his character?
I think it shows that all his skills of conciliation must have been needed, and that he was very conscious of this in writing the life of Columba. But the issue for him, and you know, I mean, he of course had the greatest of respect for Columba, and I suppose I've presented it in very simplistic terms in one way, as though the community were all united with one mind and he was of the other. But it's unlikely that the split was that exact. It's also unlikely that they were as concerned. It's highly unlikely that they were as concerned, or that any of them was as concerned as Bede makes out, because Bede was aiming to show the superiority of the thinking in the Northumbrian church. So his account is skewed a lot by bias. And also there's a lot that he apparently didn't know about Iona and about Adomnán. For instance, he seems not to have had access to the life of Columba, to Adomnán's life of Columba. But I think I certainly am very convinced by the assessments of scholars that he was a very conciliatory person and also a very subtle-minded person.
Conciliatory, but also strong-minded. He didn't just change his view because it didn't suit the community.
Well, that is true. And I mean, you know, it's an extraordinary idea of this federation, this community, and then this wider federation, and the head having one view while the troops go the other direction.
Yeah. I think
perhaps he was also convinced by the fact that the Dionysiac reckoning was actually a better one. And it is in many ways a better computus, and indeed it dominated the Western Church until the 16th century.
Yeah, I imagine he accepted that.
Yeah.
I would agree.
Sorry. Yeah, so Tim Dwyer asked questions along with bardic poems, the bardic-like poems, I think that is, in Clancy and Marcus. Were there poems from Iona that were the more impressionistic nature or personal poetry as presented by Meyer, Flower, Murphy, Carney, etc.?
At this point, I would feel like reaching for my copy of of Thomas Owen Clancy's and Gilbert Marcus's anthology, just to remind myself of what they have covered. And of course, Thomas himself will be speaking, I would imagine, about aspects of this in the next talk in the series. I suppose nature poems, lyric poems of the kind that I think may be intended or don't feature as the main text of this anthology. You know, the more simple, what popular tradition has tended to call hermit poems, hermit poetry, lyric expression of that kind, simpler kind of expression, what you get really in the anthology is a collection of poems of high learning, though one would have to say that the poems ascribed to Beagán mac Luighteach about Column Cille,
Exactly.
yeah, they really give you a sense of the seagoing saint. You get the sense of the briny ocean, the challenges of the island life, very, very strongly. You know, the sea is the whale road. All of that comes through very, very clearly, very in a wonderful way in those poems.
And also perhaps for so many of the early Irish lyrics that have a naturalistic theme, it's so difficult to ascribe them to any specific place or monastery or scriptorium or poetic school, that it's not inconceivable that some of them may have originated from Iona. It's just we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I mean, I always got the impression, but this wouldn't really agree with Jacopo's dating of the Avra, but it seems many times like an intensely personal poem, like a real lament. I don't know, Jacopo, have you considered that as, if it's a 9th century composition, it's not close to the death. Do you find a personal element within that that could be explained within the terms of a 9th century date?
Yeah, it's something that I try to explain in the book when I talk about the adoption of a strong first-person view. My point of view is that it is part of the accepted literary fiction. That is, that the St Colm Cille is inserted effectively in a wider narrative context, whereby an early 9th century poet brought it as if it had been written by someone like the Landforgel. In which case, of course, the adoption of this first-person viewpoint yields even more credibility and authority to the literary fiction. But personally, based on the cumulative evidence that I've been collecting, I don't think it is more than that.
I must say, I find that very intriguing aspect of the Avra. You know, I'm thinking of Maria Tomasco's famous article on the Celtic poet as a poet of masks, and certainly we have so many poems involve the speaker adopting a mask that you recognize, but the mask of the Landforgel is not evident in the Avra itself. You know, no one could say, if you had only the Avra, that you could extract from it the Landforgel as a poetic mask. I mean, it's extraordinarily interesting, I think, that the voice is so personal. And one does feel its personal elegy.
And when I use the term Landforgel, I use it as just because the later tradition has attributed this text to him. Mm-hmm. But actually, as far as I can see, there isn't that much early evidence associating the Avra to the Landforgel. So that even that tradition could have risen in the later centuries after the composition of the text. I think that all that we can say from my perspective, is that it was written as if it had been uttered by an Irish poet from the time of Colm Cille. So it is not a specific personal mask. It's not specifically the mask of the Landforgel. It's the mask of an early Irish semi-legendary poet, which is something that happens so frequently in Rosk literature. Rosk is typically written as statements, often prophetic statements, written in the first person or with the first person viewpoint, as if they had been uttered centuries ago. I mean, in the prologue to the Shanachas Mor, the druid Dúchtach, in many ways can be seen under a similar light.
Certainly, we don't have many poems in which the speaker does not adopt a mask. The majority of poems, but we have, arguably, we do have some. And I would argue that there isn't a great distance, perhaps any distance evident between the speaker of the poem and the identity. You know, so I wonder whether one. I think it's the most interesting question. Is a mask being adopted?
My argument on the dating of the text doesn't rest on any single piece of evidence. It is a cumulative argument based on language, style, historical considerations, internal evidence from the text. So, you know, basing a dating or a certain attribution purely on this particular point, I think would be attributing undue importance to only one aspect of a text which is otherwise incredibly complex.
As I already said, Jacob's book's over 500 pages long, so we're not going to settle that question here. I don't know if there's any more questions coming through. Maybe just if I finish with one last question. Jacopo, you mentioned the part played by observation of the physical world. I mean, we imagine observation really as, I suppose, the key to modern scientific investigation, as opposed to investigations before that. But what sort of proportion does that play? Is that a distinctly Irish thing or a particularly Irish thing? And how important really is it within science in the wider sense of the word?
Early medieval science is only minimally observational. It's if you want a number, I'd say 95% is authority based on earlier texts, especially, you know, you studied nature from the Bible. If you want to know about the movement of the sun, you first of all go to the Bible. You don't go outside and study the actual movement of the sun. You base yourself on a literate authority that is established and guaranteed by the fathers of the church. I think the place, very specific place, where the Irish are a bit different, and I would say the Irish and the English as well, is the observation of the tides. And that is for a very simple reason. There are no tides in the Mediterranean. And so you have a very flourishing development of tidal theory that to some extent is based on observation in Northumbria and in Ireland and in the Regione Scotorum. That's why specifically I think it's interesting that the Avra and so many other texts like that passage from Psalter Naran that I referred to always mention that a learned man is supposed to know about the rhythm, about the course of the sea. That is quite specific to these islands. Yeah.
Well, thank you both very much. Guarantors as na kaint na brehesin na hogshiv we renew. While we has a go lisha Lishinlach Eschatna, thank you to our audience. Gurmagov done Chille na Gaelige a chur na kaint na shaw Satul. Agus for an active the members of the Academy here, particularly Eric doing the technical work, and Grania and Barbara. And I've been asked just to finish off then, we'll do our virtual thanks to our speakers. And just a reminder of next week's lecture in the same series by Professor Thomas Owen Clancy, mentioned at least once today, on the topic Tír, Traidh, Chille, Land, Strand and Tide, Column Cille's voice and the poetics of place. But thank you all very much, and Slán.
Gurmíl Mahagwev.